first article. What we're really interrogating is it's one thing to decide to go with the wind, as you were suggesting in the early 1990s, and follow Fukuyama's, I suppose, somewhat not very far-seeing predictions. It's another thing to stick to it into the early 2000s, the mid-2000s, and the 2010s. So part of what we're trying to understand with this paper is why so much resilience of neoliberalism. And our answer is to say that to understand this resilience, you need to look at the built-up and the particular role played by the National Treasury. Not, of course, the ISP, which I agree with Dinga, is something that very much paved the way for justifying a number of neoliberal reforms, but it was the macroeconomic research group. Now, the work that was done in MERG was of very high quality. There was a report which was initially commissioned by the ANC and subsequently abandoned by it. And again, that's something Professor Belfront goes into quite a bit of detail. So the fact that the idea that there was no alternative is I think, highly misleading. There was an alternative, and if there was an alternative, there is a choice to follow a certain route. I want to say two things about this route. The first one is, you refer to Fukuyama. It's interesting I just read that Francis Fukuyama is one of the main collaborators of Alan Hirsch, one of the close collaborators of Thabo Mbeki, in a new school of governance set up, I think, at the University of Cape Town. And the School of Governance aims at training African civil servants, based on, I suppose, what Hirsch sees as the very great achievements he made in South Africa. Teaching African civil servants how to run the state. And guess what the first module is about, taught by Francis Fukuyama himself? Private sector involvement in public service delivery. Quite interesting as a choice of a first and most important session. About this issue of whether and how the ANC policy changed, and that's the last point I want to make, is I think maybe we should say something that's in the paper, I think, quite explicitly, and also in Belfront's paper. The beginning of Belfront's paper, if you look at the special issue, the first section is called The ANC, a Movement Without Policy. Now, that is something that all of our interviewees confirmed. While Kasatu was trying to build up, or the unions were trying to build up an understanding of economic policy in the 1980s in order to inform their decisions. And maybe on some counts they made wrong decisions, but there was a real effort at building the capacity of the leadership and the movement to interact with the economic policy question. It seemed that there was no equivalent within the ANC. There was a Department of Economic Policy, which by all accounts was very weak and has remained quite weak. In fact, part of what we discuss in the paper is the fact that lots of ANC policy thinking is fed by the National Treasury and by the state, not by internal bodies to reflect on these questions. And the second point is, I suppose there's a very interesting paper by Kasatu, I think Neil Coleman wrote it, called The Theories of the Transition. And in 2002, what Coleman is saying in this paper is that there is something very frustrating within the alliance, which is that the positions that are embodied in here are not discussed anywhere. There is no forum, let alone public forum, but within the alliance, within the movement, to actually discuss these policy options and put them on the table. Something that Hirsch did in his 2005 book, Seasons of Hope. He did lay some of these down, and we'll look at them later. So I think the idea that there was a choice that was made based on extensive discussion of alternatives is somewhat misleading. I think, and it's part of what we tried to highlight, it was really a capture of the policy debate by a very small group of people, Thabo Mbeki, but not just Thabo Mbeki, and an ability to orient the movement in a certain direction. Now, our discussant later today, I don't know if he's arrived already, is Ronnie Caswell. And he's written a number of pieces in the media recently, which I think are extremely interesting. Part of what he says is that as a minister, he and many of his peers had very little understanding of what really was happening in terms of economic policy in the 1990s. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, one of the points he makes is if I was to go back to that experience, the first thing I would do is study economics to understand better the implications of the choices we make there. So, I don't know, yes, there was the Soviet Union, but I think there were alternatives, and what there was certainly was a very deliberate choice to go for one particular kind of policy. And I suppose we need to question who were the beneficiaries of these policies. That's a very important question, and the answer can be a little bit unsettling.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of time. Thank you for all the questions. I'll just say perhaps two things. I think you've already answered this whole issue of alternative, and I don't think it's our role really to perhaps fully engage with the broader issue of is there an alternative, and I think this morning we heard Kevin tell us that if there is an agenda on the side of the capitalist class, there must be an agenda on the side of the working class. Indeed, I think this is a broader debate. But what we've tried to look into in the paper is to see whether, from the perspective of policymakers, at the times decisions were taken, whether alternatives were available in the South African context. And the answer, as Nicolas just insisted on, is yes. And I would also encourage you to read Bill Frank's paper. What's important about the crisis, the 1996 crisis, because I think there was a very specific question there, and the person was saying, referring to the Cold War and the situation at the time. What's important to bear in mind is that there were a number of other reasons why the choice of prudent, the set of prudent measures was adopted, which were not strictly speaking related to the crisis. Is this right? I don't know. These had to do with different pressure groups within South Africa, key interest groups putting pressure on government at the time. It also had to do, obviously, with pressure exerted by international financial institutions, particularly in relation with South Africa's rating. It had to do also with this notion, this understanding, whether fantasized or real, of the dependency of South Africa vis-à-vis foreign direct investment, as well as the need to bring back to the level of domestic investment. So there were a range of other factors explaining the choices made beyond the crisis. But on the other hand, and I invite you there to go back to the analysis, which I find quite convincing, of Adam Habib and Vishu Reaction, showing that the risk factor, the risk evaluation at the time that South Africa, that prevailed, was probably an exaggeration of the actual risk, particularly if one compares South Africa at the time to other countries going through similar transition crises. South African financial institutions, for instance, the level of political stability in the country, etc. All these indicators were, by global standards, probably much better than they were in a number of European countries at the time. And yes, as Nicolas indicated, there were alternative models, but which, as I said, were systematically rejected. And in particular, I think you answered your own question. What we question is, what we try to interrogate is the reason why it's continued well beyond the immediate threat of the 1996 crisis. I think I'm going to stop here. I thought we would have wanted to comment on the Chilean influence that maybe just say.
I realize I missed a couple of things, but I'm also not aware of time, so do you mind if I just say something about what Gilad asked about macro policy? Just to say that, of course, the idea that macroeconomic policy is neutral is at the heart of course, that it should be neutral, and that orthodoxically understood macroeconomic policy will be the one that is neutral, because that's what it's meant, is at the heart of the ideological and theoretical imperatives of neoliberalism. It derives from new classical macroeconomics. What is probably worth saying about this is, with all due respect to Michael Sachs, is that really very few people still believe this. Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist of the IMF, writes paper after paper explaining that perhaps the efficient market hypothesis and the neutrality of finance is not as we thought, and perhaps macro policy matters, perhaps monetary policy doesn't just have an influence on prices, but it has a broader influence. So, beyond people who have, I think, a very strong interest in believing in this, the sort of frontier of neoclassical economic debates, these kinds of ideas are passé, largely. So I think that makes it even more interesting that there would be such assertions. And of course, to argue that macroeconomic policy in South Africa in 2014 is neutral, when you see the level of investment in productive activities, for example, it starts to really, which is also why we did this paper, it started looking like a joke to me. to a certain extent. I mean, who can actually believe this? You know? And why is it still there? You know? Partly because the debate isn't there enough. Hopefully that will change. I don't know if I covered your question.
All right, there was no question directed at me. Maybe just to say one thing. I want to emphasize that if you go back, there was a reference to what happened in Kabul, which was the ANC conference in '85. And if you read most of the documents from '85 up to ANC joint conference on economic policy in '88 in Brazil, there isn't much sort of economic thinking on the part of the ANC about the post-apartheid. And I always say, and the former unionist from my union is here, Gavin, I always say to people that the ANC didn't know about tariffs, the lowering of tariffs and getting into the global economy and how that's important and the competitiveness. More of this came from the unions, and my union in particular, NUMSA. So I think that to say, look, it's the ANC without the sort of the responsibility of other partners I think is a bit of a misreading of the history. And I think that certain choices were made, and I think Nicolas had said, you know, there was the sort of ISP as one project. There was also the MEG report, which got a jettison. And what I got from Professor H.J. Kaiser, I'm not saying that, you know, he's got the answer to this, is how some of the people from the Department of Economic Planning in the ANC in the 90s come into the Department of Finance as trainees, as part of preparing for them in the sort of World Bank and IMF institutions for training. And then this is sort of reinforced by some of the cadre from COSATU, where there is this convergence that's happening.
Okay, next we'll take a question from the Treasury, and then Carl at the back, and then I'll take the person beside the room. Okay, I'll take three, and I'll have to see if it's time for that three.
Hi, I've just been out of Barcelona. I am from National Treasury, and I've been in that space for the past 10, 15 years, both National Treasury and Presidency. And yes, I haven't read the paper. I've been reading it sort of partly this morning when I got the journal. I want to echo what the comrade from NUMSA is saying, that there's a more complex history here at play. And the presentation that I've heard here and the statements that I've heard, I feel that each one of those can be unpacked and understood in 10 different ways. And I don't want to get into the debate here, but I do want to say that one of the things that I think that is fundamental to the build-up of the Treasury as an institution at the centre of government that's not recognised at all is the lack of capacity and the inabilities, the constraints within government that had to be dealt with in the past 20 years. And I think that the discussion of what Treasury has become and what Treasury is cannot only revolve around the macroeconomic policies without recognising the real level of government and failure that we've got.
Right, so that's Carl next. Can I ask you to ask one question only and keep it quite brief because there are a lot of hands going up.
Right, one question with many implications. So, thanks for a brilliant paper, and then also Dinga for a really very interesting sort of counter qualification of the paper. And the question I want to ask goes to the relation between those two. So, I get the sense actually from Dinga's question that maybe, or rather Dinga's comments, that maybe we're asking the wrong question. We're asking the question about how a small group of ANC people were converted and managed to take control of a set of institutions. The other question, though, is how come did this happen? How come what happened in NUMSA happened in NUMSA? Because that's a different organization, different history, different set of pressures. And I think that's a really interesting question. So, Dinga, when you left it hanging that you can talk at some other point about the sociology of the white left in the unions, you were leaving with precisely the most interesting point. And I'd like to know more both from you and from Aurelia and Nicolas, about how you put these two stories together, because it's clear that the story isn't just an ANC story.
Nicolas next, and then the business next.
I just want to make one comment following Paul's point and being really point. The way I experienced it in Nomsa was simply a process of the more people the leadership engaged with the bosses, the more they absorbed their arguments and told us that this was the real world. I mean, it's as basic as that. And this is not a thing which is unique to Nomsa. This is not a thing which is unique to the ANC. It's a characteristic of leadership. You walk into the room and the bosses tell you that this is the way the world works. And you must drop tariffs and you must become competitive. Use one example. You absorb that argument. You go back into the union or the ANC branch and you say, this is the real world. Comrades, this is not rocket science. You choose, you make a choice as leadership to believe that argument is the future of your macroeconomic policy. That's the building blocks of what becomes a policy. Then you get some researchers to find a nice argument that you can present it in a logical format. That's certainly the way we experienced it. Your reality is not the shack, the unemployed worker, the protest on the street. That reality, if you look at the people that actually designed that, they spend very little time in a general meeting. They spend very little time at the bottom of a factory or a shack. They spend their times in boardrooms with bosses and with advisors from ISP all the way through. And certainly, I think it's that economic reality that comes to dominate the politics of macroeconomic policy.
Thanks very much. I mean, I thought the inputs were really interesting. I want to make a small point, and I can anticipate the retort that that's not what the paper was about. But there are two sides. I mean, there's a treasury with technocrats, and there's an ANC which may not have known about tariffs, but certainly knew how to pool its forces and prove to the bosses that it could hold them back. Sure, with the support of people in Kasatu, which weren't just white intellectuals, there were also black intellectuals that gave gave substantial support to holding the working class back. So I think it's been a theme that we touched on here and there throughout the day. And I'm not arguing really against particular points that Dinga made, because I would agree with many of them. I'm simply making the point that Treasury can do what it likes because we don't have a counter. Maybe now we have with some of the developments in the union movement. And that the ANC and Kasatu leadership were party to holding the working class back and stealing their hope and the possibility of a surge forward. I call it stealing. We talked of corruption this morning. Well, there's a bigger corruption because we know bosses lie and steal. But our fellow leaders in the working class, we didn't know. We believed them. We didn't know they lie and steal and deliver us to the bosses.
Okay, good. I think if you have a chance to reply, then we'll take one more round of quick questions.
Thank you for the questions, but I'm going to address the one from the lady from the Treasury. I think you are completely right to point to the fact that there's a much more complex history than obviously what was in the presentation, but also that what is in the paper. We are not claiming to have done that, which a complete sociological history of the making of Treasury, and I think it remains to be done, and I think it will be a very fascinating study. I'm looking towards Ari here, because I think this guys are who can envisage that kind of thing. You are pointing to something really crucial, which is this whole question of the lack of capacity and the constraints that this places on the National Treasury in terms of governmental coordination and obviously its relation with other government departments.
But I would like to sort of turn this on its head. I'm not entirely sure how you are envisaging the issue, but on the other hand, I mean, if you look at the level of qualification and professionalization of staff within Treasury, 95% of them are highly skilled, have highly skilled managerial profiles. And as you said, on the other hand, you have departments where probably, I mean, the percentage is much, much lower than this. 54% of staff within Treasury get promoted internally, so it also shows you that professionalization is taking place internally. But one could ask the question, is this concentration of expertise and highly specialized technical skills within one single, very powerful department not playing against the efficiency of other departments across government? And I do not have the answer to that, but I think that one can look at the question from that angle. And I'd like just very briefly to take the example of SARS. I think SARS is very often branded as as emblematic of one of the key successes of South African state reform. On the other hand, if you look at similar reports of revenue authorities across the world, I mean, they are important because not only because of because they enlarge the fiscal basis, but they're also important because of the degree to which they contribute together within government economic knowledge and redistribute it across departments in the implementation of micro policies. And this is not something that's happening from SARS. So I think it's neither happening in terms of redistribution of the SARS model of organization. It's not serving other departments in creating similar. So one can actually ask whether the SARS is an enclave, technocratic enclave, or whether the model is a viable one to be followed. So it's a crucial question, yes. We haven't dealt with it fully in the paper, and I agree with you, it's a question to be addressed. But I think it needs to be looked at from various angles.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about the lack of capacity in government, to add a little bit to what Aurelia said, is crucial. But I suppose what's part of what we point to in the paper, although the more we think about it, the more I think it might warrant a separate paper, more specifically focused on this, is that there might well be a very close relationship between the concentration of capacity within the National Treasury and the very poor capacity outside of the National Treasury. Not least related to the particular forms of employment of public management in South Africa, which is one of these cases where you apply more to others than to yourself, something that you know is likely to turn people into work, that Carl describes in his work on, for example, on the health services, the people who are always looking up with often very big problems in terms of other management of basic tasks. All the drama and all the problems that new public management is causing in the context of a state that, of course, was facing huge transition and capacity issues. So I think that the relationship between the two is something very fruitful to look at, and I would agree that to just say because the rest of the state is so problematic that we need to step in, it is very heavy given the kinds of policies that the National Treasury is articulating, and in fact I'm quite convinced there's probably a relationship between the two. I don't know about the sociology of white intellectuals in the late 1980s in South Africa. I know it's been the subject of much debate. I remember exchanges between Johan Marais and Sakela about this. You were the lefties and we were, blah, blah, blah. But what I do know is that I really think that the kinds of theories of Raphael Kaplinski was really the economist who inspired a lot of the work of ISP. In fact, the person I referred to this morning, Dave Kaplan, was really one of these economists, I believe, at the time. I really think Ben Fine, you can always look to Ben Fine when you want to go to unpacking of theoretical problems. He wrote an article called Flexible Production, Flexible Theory, which shows some of the very, very strong limitations of the kind of work that Kaplinski was doing and still is doing. And part of it, I think, in the South African context was that it was assuming that South Africa was in some way a Fordist country, right? And that what was really needed was to shift into a post-Fordist production model where you would have more flexible workers, more dynamic links between workers and employers in order to be able to adapt to globalization and the constraints more complex production. And of course, Mark Hunter wrote a beautiful piece where he reviews some of the efforts that came out of this in the early 2000s. And part of the problem with that kind of approach in the South African context, is it's interestingly coming from unionists, is that it completely glossed over the kind of work-based regime that South Africa has. The fact that the notion that you suddenly have sort of productivity deals between employers and workers in a country with such adversarial labor relations was completely missing the point of what work-based transformation could or should have been about. So I think both in the theory itself and in the way in which people like Gelb and others in the late 80s were trying to fit a little bit of that and a little bit of regulation theory onto characterizing the South African economy, I think there was just something deeply wrong with it. It just didn't work. But it did provide, and I completely agree with you on this, it did provide the basis for policy prescriptions which were conveniently coherent with neoliberalism. And I'm sure this mixed with a number of what you were raising, these kinds of issues and perhaps other issues that I don't know about. I wanted to make one more point to go back to the bankrupt state issue, because I don't think I answered you, David, on this. You were saying there was a bankrupt state, wasn't this a good reason to adopt the kinds of policies that were adopted? I don't know. Part of what the paper does is to say that there was perhaps an exaggeration of some of the macroeconomic threats in the 1990s in order to justify certain policies. And I think this is perhaps one of these. Not to say that there wasn't a problem of bankruptcy, but you also need to go back to why there was a problem of bankruptcy, right? A number of things. One was, of course, the very peculiar decision that was made to guarantee all civil servants, white civil servants, pensions, and the way in which this was done, right? With a lot of people warning against the fiscal consequences of this, and the ANC decided to go ahead with this. The other one, on which a lot has been written, of course, is the decision that was made, again, very surprisingly, to give a few years to the Bantustan governments to actually run debts, guaranteeing that those debts would actually be taken over by the new South Africa. I think Candace himself, if I'm not mistaken, Candace himself has written something about this with Nicolas, if I'm not mistaken. So there's some interesting things to go back into. When we talk about the bankrupt state, what are we exactly talking about? No? What kinds of decisions were behind this? And I think maybe you're going to think we're a bit one track line, but I mean, I can't help seeing something that is setting up the stage for these policies, right? Much more than something that justifies.
All right, thanks, Nicolas. It's rare to for someone from Johnson to agree with it's a rep from the National Treasury. So, but I think what I was saying, Nicolas, is my code about looking at intergovernmental financial framework and how that's evolved is that this role of National Treasury and its dominance cannot be understood without looking at that framework that was agreed and was developed in the 90s, both constitutionalized and also implemented. I mean, for instance, our experience, it's just to take an example, is that there are all these grants from national to province to local authorities, and there's all the regulation that was there. So if we engage with a municipality about electricity, they say, no, we haven't filled the deep money that's required by National Treasury. This by October, and then all of this. And there is a range of mechanisms in which this dominance is sort of maintained and replicated. And I think it would be important if one wants to look at National Treasury as an institution, how it perpetuates certain policies, to look at how it does this and through which mechanisms. That's what I was raising about, that we need to look at that. I don't have time now, Carl, to talk about the two stories and how we join those. Maybe a swap breakfast would be important for that one, so where I can come and talk about it. But I think again, Nicolas points to this, and I'll be quick. I mean, what we see in the 80s, particularly in unions like NUMSA, is a certain kind of a skilled leadership with with some academic, intellectual background, playing an important role in the sort of policy formulation in this area. Unfortunately, many of them are white. And they are, and I don't have to go into, they're part also of the 1968 radicalization initiative. So some of the things about the state, the traditions of the Committee of Communist International, they're quite weak on this. And therefore, when it comes to the role of the state and the role of the state in economic intervention, it's their weakest point. And we see this in the first phase is through their adoption of the regulation theory, Michel Aglietta, and I always say, and with due respect, I said, sometimes when you read the people here,